Miigwech, Christelle, for the introduction. Wewena bojo, no jam Indigenous cause gaye maingan and dodem, lene lanape kwe and down, lanape king and donjaba. So I'm joining you from the Delaware Nation at Moravian Town in southwestern Ontario, which is also where the head office of Thunderbird Partnership Foundation is located. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see the presentation I'm speaking to. Okay, so I want to talk to you about First Nations mental wellness, and I want to disclose that this presentation is funded through finances that we receive from Indigenous Services Canada for the Addictions Management Information System, which is where some of the data comes from. Also, through the Public Health Agency of Canada that funds us for the implementation of a First Nations opioid and methamphetamine survey. And I have no other conflicts to declare. I am employed full-time by the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation and hold grants through Public Health Agency of Canada Indigenous Services. And I look forward to our conversation following all of the presentations for this panel. I want to start off by this one key message, which is from our stories of creation. So First Nations people across the country all have their unique story of creation. And that story of creation is our evidence base for our knowledge about our health and our wellness. And the story that I am referring to comes from the Anishinaabe Nation and is held by the Midewin Society, which is otherwise interpreted as the Way of the Heart, the Grand Medicine Society. That is sometimes, it's also referred to as the Grand Medicine Society. And that story starts off with the creator imagined the most beautiful and perfect place where life would grow. I start off with this because that sets the mandate for all of our work. And what we understand is our mandate as First Nations people, that we are forever working to create and restore the beauty in life. And that beauty comes from our understanding of how the Creator, the Great Spirit, made up our being and our relationship to the surrounding environment. I use this background of this picture because our story goes on to say that as the Creator imagined that most beautiful and perfect place where life would grow, those thoughts were sent out into the universe, and where they touched upon the darkness, they left an imprint. And that imprint is still visible today. It's forever reminding us that everything that was ever going to be needed by Anishinaabe people, by Indigenous people on this earth, was placed in the universe, and that there's always an answer. There's always a solution. We just have to pursue it. And so as we think about how we support an understanding of pain, pain from trauma, pain from substance use. We've had conversations across Canada with First Nations people, and regionally they had invited their partners that they work with to facilitate and contribute to a conversation on how do we address substance use? How do we address pain? How do we understand that? And so this on the left side of your screen, and I realize the print is way too small for you to read, but I encourage you to go to our website, thunderbirdpf.org, where you can access all of these frameworks. The one on the left is the Honoring Our Strengths Renewal Framework. And that was created over 4 years in conversation, as I said, with First Nations people across the country. And when we synthesized that conversation, it resulted in this framework. And what First Nations people said, if we are going to make a difference in how we address trauma and substance use, then we have to do it with culture, our way of thinking, our way of being at the center. On the outside ring of this model, it says that it identifies a number of key principles for guiding the way we approach our conversation around substance use. And one of the principles that is critically important to our conversation today is spirit-centered, that our culture is spirit-centered, and we have to approach the individual as a whole being, mind, body, spirit, and emotions. And that whenever we are supporting the wellness of that individual, we have to attend to the 4 aspects of self. The chapter on research identified a need to conduct research in a very specific way. And for the first time in a long time, Indigenous people, First Nations people said, we want to do research on our culture to demonstrate how it works and its importance in facilitating wellness. And so the middle framework on your screen is the Indigenous Wellness Framework. Again, it was across the diversity of First Nations cultures from east to west coast, north to south. We had a conversation, and the conversation was specific to Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices from sacred societies, from stories held in the community that transcend generations, from within languages, concepts held within the different languages. And the question was, what is a whole and healthy person? And how do you facilitate balance across the mind, body, spirit, and emotions? And when we use our culture, what should we expect the outcomes to be? And so the outcomes that were articulated are hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. And hope facilitates spiritual wellness. Emotional wellness is facilitated through belonging and connections, relationships. Mental wellness is facilitated by having a connection to meaning of life, both from this physical world, but the spiritual world as well. And then when we blend the two together, we have an understanding about the meaning of life. Physical wellness is facilitated through understanding that unique way of being and doing and attending to the whole person. And when we do that, the outcome is purpose. So hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose are understood as a way to facilitate that most beautiful, perfect place where life will grow. And we were very careful to ensure that when we were building and constructing this wellness framework, that we relied on Indigenous knowledge. It was meant to, and it supports what we know as the Native Wellness Assessment, and is implemented amongst treatment centers to measure the impact of culture. At the same time, we were conducting the research to establish the mental wellness or the First Nations Indigenous Wellness Framework. We were working on the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum framework. And when we presented the model to a national conversation around building the framework on First Nations mental wellness, there was consensus that hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose should be the focus for all of our investments in mental wellness. And so it sits at the center of the FNMWC. And it says that culture is critically important, but not only culture, Indigenous knowledge is the foundation. So the background of this model has been described as PEI red. It's the color of the earth. And that too comes from our story of creation, which tells us that when the Creator, the Great Spirit, was forming our physical vessel that would carry our spirit, it was the earth that formed the vessel that would carry our spirit. So the Great Spirit gathered up different parts of the earth to create our being. And this framework, it has a strengths-based focus. And so it helps us to understand that when we are addressing or supporting or concerns or issues, that we need to consider those issues within determinants of health. And so that's a shift from placing the onus on individuals, and we're thinking about what contributes to trauma and the behaviors that come from that traumatic experience, behavioral health. And when we're thinking about behavioral health, we have to consider it within the determinants of health, which includes colonization, past and present. It includes our connection to culture and is important for understanding within the lifespan. Oftentimes when we're talking about wellness, there's a specific population, and it's almost always the adult population. We don't consider prenatal, early childhood, or senior. And so when we're thinking about mental wellness or understanding pain even, it's important to understand that within the context of the determinants of health and across the lifespan. And in this model, it talks about trauma and substance use challenges existing together. It's not one or the other, it's both. Although mental illness is understood and presented in this framework as on its own as well. So here's an example of culture as the foundation and how that's applied in the context of trauma and substance use. In the treatment center for First Nations youth who have issues with solvent abuse, inhaling gas was the primary solvent that was being misused at this time. The assessment of the youth when they came into treatment, in order to plan for what the focus was and what would be offered to meet the youth's needs, we had elders come into the program, and they would sit with the youth and do a spiritual assessment. What that meant was they'd sit and have a chat, and the elders, through that discussion, would develop a connection, a relationship with the youth, but they would also develop a spiritual connection and relationship. And at the end of that discussion, the elders would give a prescription. And that prescription might be for a ceremonial practice or another type of intervention, such as the use of natural medicines. It was always by choice. And so we would educate the youth and their parents about this practice, and then they would choose if they wanted to participate or not. For the sake of this story, I'm going to tell you about John. And John was he was big in his physical presence. He was tall, but his presence was known because that's how he facilitated control over his environment. And so John would pretend or intimidate you, pretending to, act as though he was going to hit you or hit an object like the wall or something like that. And so he controlled his environment through his physical presence. And he was tall for his age. And so that worked to his advantage. So he had initially declined the offer to go and sit with the elders. And but he got curious, as all of the other youth went to see the elders, and they came back with their own experience, their own explanation and story of their experience. John's curiosity grew, and he eventually decided that he would go and check them out. And so he sat with them, and then throughout their conversation, John would ask them questions, and the elders as well would ask John questions. And so one of the questions that the elders asked John was if he had ever been injured someplace around his neck. And John replied in anger and said, "No, I never ever tried to hang myself. I didn't do that." And they went on to talk. And then John said, "Well, why did you ask me that question?" And they told him, "We can see something around your neck." "Well, what do you see?" They said, "It looks like a TV that doesn't get the station in very good, like when it gets all snowy." And John knew what they were talking about. And so he said, "Well, how come you can see it and I can't see it?" They had a conversation about that. They went on just having casual conversation. And then finally, John said, well, is it ever going to go away, or what do we do about it? And so they said to him, we can take care of that. He asked how. So they explained to him what they were going to do. They used natural medicines, the traditional medicines that we often use for smudging. Medicines have a spiritual foundation, and they work directly with our spirit. And so they explained that to John. They said, we're going to sing a song for you as well. And he said, well, what good is the singing going to do? And so they talked to John about the importance and the sacredness of our knowledge, and that our stories, when we teach about our knowledge, and when we're connecting to this, it's about the connection to the spirit, and that our language sounds like a song. And so talking to his spirit, connecting to the great spirit, the creator, through song would help to facilitate the healing. So John said he was willing, he would try it out. So they smudged him off, they sang a song, and then they told John, now, what that did to you over time is it blocked your ability to really express how you were feeling, connect your feelings with your thoughts. Sounded like cognitive behavioral therapy. They didn't use that word, but they were telling him about the importance of his thinking, his feelings, and his actions, and that they had to be in balance, and he needed to be aware, and he could be in control of his thoughts, feelings, and actions. And so the prescription that they gave him was blueberries and peanuts. And they said, whenever you feel like you're angry, like you want to lash out, like you want to hurt somebody or something, go to the kitchen and ask for your medicine, and they'll give you a bowl of blueberries and a bowl of peanuts. Sit down at the table, eat them both, and when you're done, go find a counselor and talk to them about what you were experiencing. So John did that. The blueberries are a sacred medicine. Berries are the first food that come from the earth, and they're critically important for our wellness, just like bringing a newborn baby to your breast. That milk from our mother is important for our wellness. We think about berries in the same way. The peanuts were a de-escalation technique. By the time it took John to take the shells off the peanuts and eat the blueberries, he had de-escalated in the intensity of his emotions and was more clear about his thoughts. And so over time, John was able to see how well that worked for him, and was able to change his behavior and develop a connection to his own spirit, that he went on then to connect spiritually through other cultural events. And so when we think about pain for First Nations people, we have many words in our languages that describe pain. The belief is that we have this internal strength to help us through that. But we know that colonization has put up that block, just like the blockage that John was experiencing. There's those experience of colonization that have cut us off from our language, from our culture, and our ceremonies. And as a result, we carry the experience of colonization at all levels of our being, in every aspect of our being. That, however, does not mean, though, that we have lost our culture and our identity. The Great Spirit is the one that gave us our identity, and so that persists, whether we realize its meaning or have access to the practice of celebrating our identity and our culture. And so the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum framework helps us to think about a shift from a focus on deficits to a focus on strengths, and understanding the significance and importance of our culture to support our wellness and help us through the challenges of life. So in that conversation, when we were having the discussion about how does culture facilitate wellness across all of the different cultures in Canada of First Nations people, that conversation identified at least 40 common cultural interventions. We call them interventions for the sake of this discussion because it was specific to addressing substance use. This is not a pan-Indian model. And when we talk about pan-Indianism, it means grabbing something from maybe the Mi'kmaq people, blending it with something that we learned about Dene culture, and then adding on a little bit of Coast Salish culture. That's pan-Indianism. We grab what we want and we blend it together and we say, this is the way it is. What we did in this process was have a discussion about cultural practices and then name them. We didn't write down the recipe for conducting cultural practices and ceremonies, and we didn't describe them as the method for treating substance use and addictions and the psychological trauma and pain that people experience as a result of that experience. Instead, what we did was we documented how language is critically important to understanding worldview. Knowing that there are many different languages of First Nations people, and that language then informs the stories, informs our story of creation. It informs our cultural practices and ceremonies. It informs the way that we are together. And so all of the cultural practices here are common practices, although they are specific and different from each other by language, by connection to land, and by the nation of people. And so when we developed the Native Wellness Assessment that measured the impact of those cultural practices for addressing substance use, we have the results of hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. Now we've filtered the data to look specifically at how does land as a cultural practice, connection to land as a cultural practice facilitate wellness. And so this is 3 years of data. And across the 3 years, look at the green bars because in comparison to the brown bars on the graphs, it shows us consistently that there is an increase in wellness across time. So these are pre and post measures. And specifically, we see that there is consistent improvement in belonging and in purpose. So belonging and purpose are two elements that balance each other in the medicine wheel that I showed you earlier. Belonging sits in the south and purpose sits in the north. And so they have a direct relationship. And so for people who are addressing substance use or finding a way through their trauma to their wellness, it's critically important that they have relationship to family and community, but also relationship to land and environment, to our relatives in creation. That helps them to facilitate an understanding about their purpose in life. We see, though, that those who do not have those connections, those positive role models, mentors, and relationships, who don't have a belief that their identity matters, are 3 times more likely to use opioids in a harmful way. And for First Nations people who have unresolved grief and loss are 3 times more likely to use opioids in a harmful way, who have that history of trauma. Now, why is it that we have one generation after another without resolve of that history of trauma, without resolve for the complicated grief and loss issues experienced by many First Nations and whole communities? And that's because we haven't had a conversation about residential schools before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so in those national dialogue sessions in Canada, First Nations were talking about residential school experience across 5 generations for the very first time. That's a lot of trauma to pass on from one generation to the next. And it builds and it is expressed in all kinds of ways. In this story, it's about substance use. We also know from the survey looking specifically at methamphetamine use that we are now seeing on average, people use methamphetamines when they're 28 years old and as early as 14 years old. In our youth-specific data, we see the first time use at 12 years old. So the question should be, why are they using methamphetamines at 12 and 14 years old? Well, people say they prefer methamphetamines over other substances because it's cheaper, it's easier to get, but because it is a better relief for emotional pain. So emotional pain, again, transcends generations without resources to address it. Remember the disconnect from our culture and our identity and ceremonial practices through colonization has meant that those practices have lived on the underground or at the periphery of our communities and have not been formalized in our programs and services, but they are moving in that direction, especially with the creation of the Honoring Our Strengths Renewal Framework and the Mental Wellness Continuum Framework, where First Nations people are saying our culture is, and our own knowledge and evidence is critically important for facilitating wellness, shifting our experience around emotional pain. We also know that the pandemic has made these conditions even worse. And so we see an increase in methamphetamine and opioid use during the pandemic. So how do we think then about Indigenous harm reduction? Oftentimes people think that harm reduction is in stark contrast to Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices, and that the two cannot mix. That's not true. That's a colonized way of thinking, to think of culture as not embracing relationships and people, no matter what their condition. Our culture says the Creator, the Great Spirit, created all of mankind. And especially for Indigenous people, our relationships with each other, family and community, are of the highest value in our value system. And so our harm reduction approaches have to be grounded in Indigenous knowledge. And we can think about using our culture, our connection to land, our ceremonial practices to facilitate a reduction in harm, not only to individuals, but to families and communities as well. And so our policy focus on Indigenous harm reduction is different. Now, for clinicians, licensed clinicians, your ability to work with unlicensed professionals is challenged. Now, it's not that you are responsible for or facilitating culture and ceremonial practice, but it is critically important that you are aware of the Indigenous population that perhaps resides in your geographical area of practice and develop a relationship with them to understand the community context and dynamics. So facilitating an understanding of those broader social and system-wide issues that contribute to substance use for Indigenous people are really important for harm reduction and facilitating wellness. And so the determinants of health. We also know from the data, and this is not uncommon and unlike the rest of the population in Canada. But food security and housing are critical factors in addressing substance use. And so that emotional pain manifests physically, and we see that in the food insecurity and in housing. So when people don't have food security, and the majority of people who answered this survey said that they are fairly often unable to buy food for their household, and they're also 3 times more likely to use methamphetamines compared to those who do have food security. And homelessness is a huge issue, both in rural and remote communities, First Nations communities, as well as urban environments. And so we have to be conscientious that people who live in rural and remote areas have the same issues, but do not have the same availability or access to services. So how do we work together? This hub and spoke model, it helps us to realize or to think about how community is central to the way we address substance use and trauma, and that the resources that we can benefit from in partnership external to communities, but also how clinical practice working alongside cultural practice, land-based services, supporting the First Nations government, chief and council in conversation and understanding how different substances impact on not only, again, the individual, but family and community is critically important. So it's all hands on deck. It's both culture and ceremonial elders, cultural practitioners, frontline community-based workforce, and clinicians supporting First Nations communities through crisis intervention, rapid access to addictions medicine, harm reduction, attending to the determinants of health, and providing support to families. That's an expanded role oftentimes for clinicians, but it's developing that network and those relationships. When you shift your thinking to that whole person, whole community perspective, and we think about if we invest something for individuals, the question should be, what is the expected outcome for the family and community? And what's the pathway to achieve those outcomes for the whole family and the community? So thank you very much for your attention, and my time is up. Thank you.